let's see here. Okay, we should be live here. 3, 2, 1. Okay, we should be live now here, folks.
So make me host, Catherine.
Yes, I will do so right now.
Okay.
Okay, we're ready, folks.
Okay, Nancy, you're on.
Great. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the first conversation of the new series, Inside the News, Conversations with Journalists. I'm Nancy Dobbs. I'm the president of the Sonoma County Local News Initiative. And along with Sonoma West Publishing, we're co-sponsoring this series of conversations. Sonoma County Local News Initiative is a nonprofit formed for the express purpose of supporting Sonoma West as well as local journalism in our communities. I hope you'll consider supporting Sonoma County Local News Initiative. So I want to get quickly to introducing our panelists so we can get to the conversation. First, Lowell Bergman, who's recently retired as the chair of the Investigative Journalism Project at Berkeley. He won his Pulitzer Prize. Lowell, I keep wanting to say your Nobel Prize. I don't know, it's just in the news lately.
That was years ago.
Yeah, that was years ago.
Pulitzer's better.
Won his Pulitzer Prize when he was working as a journalist for the New York Times. Also joining us, Neil Chase, who's the founding CEO of CalMatters, which is an important new statewide news hub, gathering statewide news and investigative journalism from Sacramento, a much needed addition to our news landscape. Prior to this, he was the executive editor, of the Mercury News and of East Bay Times. Raleigh Atkinson, of course, who is the publisher of Sonoma West Publishing, and Raleigh is going to moderate the conversation. So Raleigh, take it away.
Thank you. I'm also the technical host, so I'm double tasking here to keep our conversation clean and focused on what we're going to talk about. I think there's two things to throw it off. I don't think I need to do much prompting to get Neil and Lowell talking on these subjects. So I'm gonna throw this out there and then kind of step aside for several minutes. What's on everyone's mind I think are two things around this area. It's astounding, I guess, but it's a question. It's an open question. Can the United States of America have a fair and free election? And what has gotten us to this point where that's even a question that has to be discussed. So I'll just start there. I've been looking at my news feed today, and I've just been reading breaking news around, efforts of disinformation that are just happening everywhere. I mean, in my hometown today, which is Frederick, Maryland, there was a federal arrest of a guy who was putting threatening letters in people's mailboxes wherever he found a Biden sign on the lawn. And he was saying, I'm tracking you and I'm coming after you. I don't know what we're looking at. I don't know. Maybe Lowell or Neil know better what we're looking at.
Well, just to start, obviously the events, not just 4 years ago. I should explain that I just finished a 4-hour film that's up on HBO called Agents of Chaos, which is about the 2016 election and largely the Russian interference and the alleged Russian connection to Donald Trump. So I've been immersed in all this stuff for 4 years, mostly trying to understand how did a reality TV star become president of the United States? How did that happen? And the other part of it is that the startling events that have taken place, particularly over since the pandemic, have really jumbled many people's assumptions about where is there a future. And when I retired from UC Berkeley, which was actually from the faculty on August 1st of 19, but stuck around for a while, they asked me to give a talk, which got postponed, which I just gave. And it's reflections on 50 years in journalism and the coming Civil War. So things are obviously flying out of control. And in my view, however this particular election comes out, the real question is that even if Donald Trump is, let's say, totally destroyed in terms of the popular vote, that's not the end of it. Donald Trump isn't the sole, despite everything he says, responsible for everything that just happened and will happen in the future. This is a much more difficult and entrenched problem that's going to be with us for a long time. And I won't go any further than say that I've come to a conclusion myself, examining what was going on. We couldn't get it into the 4-hour film in terms of Russia and Trump. And that is, this is really a situation where the First Amendment has become a suicide pact. That the New York Times got into this in a very long piece last week on Sunday. But the real question is going to be the regulation and control of content on the internet and how to deal with that, given all the legal precedents that make that very, very difficult, the popular view, both on the liberal side and the conservative side, that we should have, if you will, a John Stuart Mill type 19th century, anything goes conversation. It just doesn't work with electronic media. And we've known that for 100 years. And I'll stop right there.
Yeah.
I mean, just as a beginning, because this really is unique. I mean, what's happening, and it requires re-examining a lot of the presumptions we've had up until now.
Neil, your take?
Yeah, it's fascinating hearing from Lowell after 4 years, after years of being immersed in that movie, right, and putting this story together, having dug so deeply into the disinformation of the past few years. He's got a fascinating perspective on it. You're right, Lowell, the technology, we talk about the technological differences, right? There was a time when there were 2 newspapers and 3 television stations in your house, and that's how you got most of your information. And maybe, you know, people talking in the community, right? And that was it for information sources. People blame the internet, the technology for the way things have changed. And they certainly have enabled these changes, but it's the way it's used, right? It is the people who figure out how to use this technology for what I think we in journalism would call evil, for disinformation. There have always been people out there who've tried to convince you with advertising that something that was true is not true. But the ability to conceal the sources of it, the ability to disguise it as something else, the ability to come up with a long-term plan to change the way a group of people think and attack them in different ways using technology in ways that we don't completely understand, enables things that, to Lowell's point, are going to require some regulation and a different look at how we manage the information economy. I mean, for me, my take on this over the past few years has been in the process of trying to figure out how to preserve journalism, how to keep journalism going. There's so many different models of how we keep journalism alive these days. There was a good run of close to 200 years where the newspaper was the main way to communicate with people, the main source of how marketers communicated with people, advertisers communicated with people. And so there was enough money there to publish newspapers and to run the news business in a way that worked for a while. What we're now facing, and there's no better example than at Sonoma West, right, coming up with new ideas on how to structure the business in order to keep journalism alive in these communities. There are days when I feel like we're making great progress because you have what Sonoma West is doing, you have what we're doing at CalMatters, what other people are doing to create and maintain journalism at a level that we hope will be enough. But then you look at what we're up against, and the kind of disinformation, the kind of ways people are using technology to get messages out there that are not more than incorrect, right? They are intentionally designed to deceive and to change somebody's perception about something. You spend a lot of days wondering, even if we can sustain journalism, can journalism ever keep up? Can you, if you spend all day fact checking and shooting down things that somebody says, once the lie is out there, the fact checking is far less efficient, a lot less effective, and it's really important to do what we're doing, which is to keep journalism alive and well and active. But I don't know that it's like we're playing the wrong game, right? We're up against something that we can't even understand.
Can I suggest that one of the problems, and like when I say 50 years, I mean, I think I've done over 100 network news magazine pieces, about 50 documentaries for Frontline, and just tons of stuff. And I finally realized about 2 years ago, when I was looking at the Trump phenomenon, and I know Trump, and that facts don't matter. And what that means is that rational discourse based upon, Michael John or John Stuart Mill, this was all based on the idea that facts could be proven and that we had agreed upon sort of logic. Now we know that doesn't normally work in a lot of cases. For instance, it didn't work with Nazi Germany. But when I went back to try to figure this out or figure out what was going on, I ran into the quote from Joseph Goebbels that we couldn't have done it without radio. An electronic transmission of information is different than print. And I was, before we started, I mentioned Herbert Hoover. So in investigating this phenomenon, go back and read Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was faced as Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge in the early 1920s with radio out of control. Electronic transmission that was instantaneous, unfiltered, with a mass audience that only depended upon how big the radio station was, how big the signal was. Now, in fact, Hoover was one of the people who decided there can only be a signal of 50,000 kilowatts because 50 kilowatts because that's as big enough for any one station. You could have a station as they had in Mexico or offshore that went everywhere, like the internet. So what we have is a technology that's different than print. It doesn't have any mediation in it, electronic media. And what happened in the United States, and it still exists, for instance, in the EU, is control over who gets to use that technology and what they can put up on it. And if you don't meet those standards, you don't get to do it. And that Hoover's the one who started with licensing radio stations. And that's where the concept of the public interest was a requirement in the licensing procedure. And when he became president, his Federal Radio Commission, this is before the FCC, looked at a radio station that was licensed in Los Angeles. It's going to sound like deja vu, okay? It was run by a right-wing minister, evangelical, who went after who went after Jews, Blacks, Catholics, promoted the Ku Klux Klan, and extorted people with his remarks on, he would say things like, I know something about someone and describe them generically, and you'd better make a big donation if you don't want me to mention your name. That's one of the ways he got donations. So there were a lot of complaints. So Hoover's Radio Commission yanked his license. He challenged that and took it up to the federal appellate court in the District of Columbia, and he lost. And he lost his license in 1931. And that's what happened. That was then adopted by the Federal Communications Commission. And until 1985, depends on what part of it you look at it, from 1985 to 1987, those regulations, which expanded, had all kinds of other aspects to it in electronic broadcasting, were eliminated by the Reagan administration with the help of Congress and all the national broadcasting networks. Since that, what I'm saying is that before 1986, Rush Limbaugh couldn't have gotten on the air. Donald Trump could. It came to me. The reason I got into this is I knew I had to learn a lot of this when I joined ABC News in New York, based in Berkeley. I had to read all these things, the standards and practices, signed documents. This was what governed broadcasting. And when I saw Donald Trump go after Megyn Kelly, if you remember those moments at the very beginning of the 2015, summer of 2015 and fall, I realized, wait a second, he can't do that on network television. That's it. It was illegal at one point to have a personal, if you didn't attack somebody personally on the air before 1987, because the stations involved had to give equal time to the person being attacked. Okay, and they could reply. And the stations wouldn't allow it to happen. You'd be beeped out. And when they talk about, they have to push a button to stop Trump, there's a 3-second delay in broadcasting. They're all lying. There's a 3-second delay. They could beep out any curse word or any one right in the control room. The reason it didn't happen is the networks want to make money, and they've been upfront about it from the beginning. The famous Les Moonves, head of CBS, about Donald Trump. He said, Donald Trump is great for CBS, but he may not be good for America. And what he was referring to was the ratings. So that's really what happened. And there is an answer to the problem that is in our own history. And today in Europe, you couldn't do this. You couldn't use the internet this way. It's not wide open. But today, even after we did this thing with 2 hours just about the Russian military involvement, intelligence community involvement in the US election, today, the Russians can operate on Facebook or any other outlet on the internet legally and do any disinformation they want to do. It's not against the law, and it's not against a regulation, a federal regulation, even though the internet belongs to taxpayers, just like the airwaves. The only thing they could indict Prigozhin and those people in Washington for the disinformation campaign around the election was the problem that the thing they used was that Prigozhin took out $2,500 in ads on Facebook. That's illegal because the foreign power, and he didn't register as an agent of a foreign power. But otherwise, disinformation is totally legal. And if you do it on the internet, Congress gave them immunity. You can't sue the platform. On radio, they learned that disinformation could be very, very dangerous and cause mass panic. You remember Orson Welles and War of the Worlds in 1939 on the radio, and everybody in New Jersey was running off to go to New York. After that, the FCC said, from now on, you have to say, this is a dramatization. And it had to come in at regular intervals in radio, and later is labeled on television. It's a reenactment. So I'm just saying this is not a totally new problem. It has to do with various things that need to be addressed directly. And one part of the problem is that the legal community and most publishers and broadcasters have adopted the idea that anything goes. We should be able to do whatever we want and say whatever we want, whenever we want, as long as we can make more money that way.
That's a hard genie to get back in the bottle, right?
What?
That's a hard thing to change back. I mean, when radio first launched, it was a little bit of the Wild West, and then regulation came in, and television sort of the same way. The question I think now is, are we at a point where there's any chance of real regulation, or what would it take to get real regulation of
Civil war?
Right?
There's going to have to be blood in the streets.
Lowell, quit that.
What?
Quit doing that.
Quit doing what?
Saying that.
Well, I'm saying it, not that
You're too old for civil war.
It's going to happen, but when people are having, I'm a veteran of the 60s. People didn't show up at demonstrations armed to the teeth. there were very few gun battles on the street in the 60s. There were incidents that took place, bank robberies, bombings, all kinds of things happening. But we have a situation that's out of control. We have a, you also have a right to bear arms, right? Which is totally cuckoo, but that's what we have. The legal community has crafted various doctrines that need to change. It didn't exist at one time.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not facing radio though. We're facing the internet and these social media monoliths that have perfected manipulating psychology and behaviors. I mean, it's not just it's beyond radio. There's a little bit of awakening around news consumers that understand they're being manipulated, that they, when something's free at Google, et cetera, they are the product. You've become the product, and what you just paid for is giving up your privacy. But there are many people, and I don't know what the degree or percentage of the folks are, but there's a large percentage that don't understand how they're being manipulated, and there's a few that do. And for us truth seekers, Neil and Lowell, that are, that try to be the arbiters of facts and delineate that out. I think the job of journalists and journalism's quite different than, when the three of us got into the profession. I mean, I looked at being the arbiter of fact, just, checking your sources and, putting it on the typewriter in the correct order of the words, and that was it. But that's not the end of the day. I mean, we have a whole list of other chores and jobs we have to do. Our job description is, I mean, I think it's evolving. Maybe we don't even know what it is, but it's.
You're right, Raleigh. One of the big differences is when you were a reporter in the 60s covering those protests, for instance, you were the source people were using to find out what was going on, right? You filed your stories. Your stories got on the radio, they got on TV, they got in the newspaper, and you were what was known as the first draft of history, right? You sat down and read the newspaper. The afternoon paper told you what happened that morning in your town. That's where you found out about it. Today, somebody who's working as a professional journalist, taking the time to understand a story, checking things, writing carefully, being edited, going through all the other stuff you do to publish something online. By the time your story gets out there, there are 50 versions that are distorted, floating around in circles you don't even see. The New York Times, in their sort of a mea culpa on the 2016 election, said one of their mistakes was not getting out and interviewing people across the country, understanding what's going on. They're trying to do a better job of that now, but it's not just about getting out and talking to people. If you're not in all of these groups, if you're not watching these QAnon message groups, if you're not, and it is radio and TV, right? It's Rush Limbaugh, it's Fox News. There are lots of different places where the stuff is getting out that is, journalists are now fighting to correct the record rather than creating the record.
Well, I agree with both of you, but I also think that I got lost trying to figure out what do we do about this, or how does it change? How does it stop? Right. And I'm just saying that the fundamental first problem is that we know people are lying. We know people have always been manipulated by media and by politicians and so on. That's not new. There have been different iterations of the technology. I recall, I started out in hot type as actually, linotype machine, and as an apprentice typographer in New York City. And I saw the newspapers and tabloids then doing all kinds of manipulation. But it's different when it's instantaneous, like the internet. The problem is the two things that regulate the internet, the content of the internet. One is Section 230 of a federal law that was passed in 1996 that gives immunity to the platforms that provide the message, basically, the Facebooks, the Googles, and so on. And the other is a 1997 Supreme Court decision written by a liberal Justice Breyer, which is called Reno versus the ACLU, and it's about the internet and pornography. And it says that you cannot regulate pornography on the internet. Why not? Well, because they defined it as a non-intrusive, not as intrusive as broadcasting, and a dial-up system that's a startup that we have to let operate so it becomes the new printing press. That's it. Those are the two main regulations on content that still exist today. But the internet has become an amalgam of print, video, all forms of telling stories. And it's universal, and each one of us, when we push a button, potentially could send our message to billions of people. There is no First Amendment that guarantees people the right to have instant universal distribution. But Facebook, Google, Twitter, all of these the oligopoly that controls the internet in reality, that won't give that up. They don't want to be licensed to do this.
So Lowell, how do we solve that problem?
We have to have, it's the same thing that Herbert Hoover did. You have to have laws. He did it. There was no law on the radio frequencies, early 1920s. Everybody was cutting into each other, so on. So he did basically licensing at like an IP address. Same thing, the federal government put in regulations on the internet to keep the craziness from happening.
So is bringing back the fairness doctrine, or
I don't think the fairness doctrine per se should be readopted, but there are definitely ways to do things. Look at what the EU is doing. In Europe, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and everyone is accountable to an agency of the European Union, and they enforce the regulations on what they can do and can't do, particularly around hate speech. Look what the French are currently doing around hate speech. They had a law declared unconstitutional that would ban it. Now they're going to bring it back because of what's just the beheading that just took place. So it's a problem everywhere. It's not just in the United States. Now, some countries like China and to a certain extent Russia use total control of the internet to control the population. China is a totalitarian government, basically. It has a communist party. And I learned from spending time in Russia on this story that Putin is more like an absolute monarch. He's not really in control. Whereas a good friend of mine, a Russian journalist who we worked with, said, sometimes Putin pushes a button and nothing happens. Russia is not China, right? So there are different places, different levels of control, but nobody runs it like the US. It's just free for all. Child pornography has recently been made illegal on the internet and with some enforcement regulations over the last 2-3 years. But because of the case I mentioned, Reno versus the ACLU, where the ACLU won, pornography is an epidemic on the internet. So we're not just talking about information about whether or not Trump screwed up on the coronavirus or not. The whole atmosphere of the country, the whole consciousness of the country is filled with trash.
Yeah.
And education, in the middle of all that, public education has been defunded. So there are two major problems in my mind.
Let me switch the focus just a little bit here, and Neil's going to get to talk about CalMatters a little bit. Another threat to to truth and fact finding is the journalism and newspaper industry itself. I mean, it's not just that social media has been a platform for misinformation. It's been a platform that has torn asunder the business model of newspapers and journalism in the past, and that old market-driven commercial advertising model is pretty much dead, just waiting to get buried. And we need to move on to new news models. So the decimation or decline of that model has really enfeebled journalist voices. You know, we don't have the financial fiscal support we used to have, and we're struggling to build enough resources, maintain enough resources to do this, you know, Herculean task that we see in front of us to confront and fight all this disinformation. I mean, you know, Neil said it at the beginning. I mean, if we were just left alone to do the job we always thought we were doing, you know, we would still be struggling because of the lack of economic resources. We have new job descriptions, Neil, and we need new models. And CalMatters, I heartily endorse as a really strong journalism model. If you could let folks know about that and respond to the bigger picture.
I'm happy to. Thanks. I as I said earlier, you know, this having a conversation like this makes me, while I'm very proud of what we've done, not just us, what people are doing with new kinds of news organizations. It's very tempting to say, yeah, but nothing we can do is actually going to solve this. It's so big and so out of control. You know, to Lowell's point, things might have to get a whole lot worse before they even have a chance to get better. But that's the negative side. The positive, I think, is that amid all of the changes in the business model for journalism, the end, as you said, of advertising as a way to make money. And I don't at all hold the social media platforms liable for this, right? They created a more efficient way to do advertising. They created a better way to put ads in front of people, to find the right person who wants to see the ad at the right time. And we in the news business didn't match that. So we lost that market competition. But a number of folks have decided that news has gone from something important that can be sustained by market forces to something that has to be sustained by the community, more like a civic organization, or, you know, to Lowell's point, public education, right, is when it's working is sustained by public dollars. And what we've done at CalMatters is created a news organization that is funded by philanthropy, by individual donors, by foundations, by individual members. The model is not new. The people at public television and radio stations look at us and say, you guys think you invented something? We've been doing that for decades. It's a public media kind of a solution, but with the ability to be creative and the ability to evolve this business. You know, CalMatters started with 6 people in Sacramento, and I wasn't there at the start. I was at the Mercury News before this, but they realized that most news organizations had stopped covering Sacramento. We at the Mercury News certainly had. We were down to 1 person there, shared by 25 papers across California with a single owner. And when the money dropped out of the news business, they had to drop the stuff that was least popular, and some of the state coverage was the first to go. And so people who care put up some money, hired a handful of journalists, started with 6 people 5 years ago. We're now at 40 plus people, probably be at 50 by the middle of next year. And started out covering the legislature in Sacramento. Now we're covering a lot of issues statewide, doing a lot of work on poverty and inequity across the state, doing a project that's relevant to this conversation right now that a number of nonprofit news organizations are doing. And it's important to point out, while we are doing this for California, there are organizations doing this for cities and regions and states across the country. And a bunch of us got together on a thing called VoteBeat, which includes something Lowell knows a little bit about, which is the investigative reporting project at Berkeley that he used to run. The students in that program are helping us with this. And it started with the idea that there are not enough journalists on the ground right now to cover this election. With everything, you talked about the intimidation in Frederick, the issues about ballot boxes we're seeing in California, the questions about how votes are being delivered, and the questions raised about the mail, and the questions about how counts are going to happen and when they're going to happen. And so a number of nonprofits got together, raised close to $1 million, and launched VoteBeat, which is putting 30 more reporters on the ground across the country to cover this election from now through the end of December, assuming, unfortunately, that the election won't end until the end of December. To cover these issues. And it's really important that we do this, and we're already knocking down a lot of the crazy stories you're hearing. But you know, what we do is important, and we are here because people support us. We're a nonprofit, and I appreciate the chance to tell people about it. We have a daily newsletter that tells you everything about what's going on in California. But as we work as hard as we can to cover everything happening during this election and all the stories that are tied to how the election is administered and how it's conducted, every time you see one of these stories take off out of nowhere that somebody launched, and this is not somebody making a flip remark that gets out of hand, right? This is intentional disinformation created by people who are very good at it, who know that if you write something a certain way and you publicize it in a certain way, you make it look like it came from certain people, you create accounts that will, you create a message on Twitter, then you create a bunch of fake accounts that will spread the message and accelerate it. This is a science. This is not a bunch of crazy people sitting around dreaming up schemes. This is a very aggressive scientific approach to spreading disinformation. I think we're very important. I think we're doing the best we can. I think we're doing really important work, and we've made a difference. We see our stories reflected in legislation that's passed in the state. We see investigative work that has changed things around evictions during the pandemic and state contracting and things like that. But boy, it's real easy some days just to look at what we're up against and say, I don't know how you fight this. It's scary.
Let me throw out two topics, multiple choice, and you can pick one or the other either of you want to talk about. One is the DOJ case against Google that happened yesterday, 2 days ago, and the other one is the idea of public financing for journalism. That's surprisingly moving kind of quickly through congressional hearings or discussions.
Well, the public financing, let me just say that the history of journalism in the United States, by the way, the press is the only private industry that's in the Constitution. You read the Constitution, there's only one.
Well, it doesn't get me a paycheck.
Well, it might.
Yeah, it might.
Well, first of all, there's the PPP, but anyway, but what I'm getting at is all through history, the American history, the government has helped the press and the technology. First, the technology around it, whether it was telegraph, radio, TV, internet, government money, taxpayer land, airwaves, are all involved. And what Neil is saying is, I think, is that good journalism, or what we would call public interest journalism, is a public good, like the fire department, like the library. And we have a long tradition of it. So look, when I was first getting into the journalism business, afternoon newspapers were going out of business. TV was putting them out of business. Why? They were taking their ads because people went home, turned on TV, and the auto dealer would be on TV. You didn't need the newspaper anymore. So what did Congress do? It suspended the antitrust laws for all newspapers. And they thrived. TV got bigger and bigger. It was regulated up, as I said, until the mid-1980s. But I think that one of the issues, Neil, that really hasn't been discussed very much by the news business is that the fact that you make a compelling case, good example, the first New York Times piece about Trump's wealth and how he wasn't self-made, his dad gave him $400 million and so on, had no traction. Yeah, okay, so his dad, we all know he was made by his dad, so what? And nobody repeated it, nobody used it. Now, that was 11,000 some odd words. I think it was the longest single story in the history of the New York Times. And what the public atmosphere, the lack of of really critical public education, similar to the public education I got in New York City in the 1950s, doesn't exist in large parts of the United States. So you can't expect the population to understand the manipulation itself. And if you add this constant, very, very attractively done audio-visual presentation, so you're just a couch potato, you don't have to think, and it's presented to you, you can believe it. And it's been going on for a long time. It just got to the point, in my view, of a critical moment where everything from the racism in America on, all surfaced at the same moment and overwhelmed the system, sort of like a virus. Because how are you going to write a long investigative piece for somebody who believes Donald Trump? They don't care.
Yeah.
You can talk to him from today to tomorrow. I have relatives who say he says what we're thinking or what we want to say.
There were, it's not so much here, I'm sitting in Northern California where it's really hard to find a Trump supporter. I mean, it's
Really?
Yeah, they're much more scarce than mushrooms. But my first 2 decades or so of journalism were in Maryland on the East Coast, and it was they didn't call it purple states then, but they were. I mean, they were Republican, Democrats. I mean, it was a real mix. And at the local newspaper, and I guess I grew up to be someone that would call me a liberal, but I kind of was at the time, I guess. But I could have conversations with everybody. I mean, George Wallace was running for president at the time, and I'm not sure he carried Maryland in the primary, but he came real close to carrying Maryland in the primary in whether that was 68 or 72, I don't remember. But as a journalist, I could have a conversation on both sides of the street. That's not going to happen now. You just, that coarsening and I, that's strictly at the feet of social media and the manipulation of the information we get. I don't know how. I read a good piece. I don't know if it was the Times or someone else, and they're traveling around. I think it was NPR. They're traveling around the country and they're trying to interview the undecideds. And they're talking to both sides of the undecideds, and even the conversations of the undecided sounds very decided to me. They sound very divided to me. So,
Yeah.
How we gotten to this?
Well,
I don't.
yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you, but there was, in the 1960s, at different points, the country was divided, whether it was the Vietnam War, whether it was civil rights. There were, the cities were burning. You're talking about the military in the streets. I know by the early 70s, I've had the rare experience of being in the subject of FBI investigation when I was a journalist, and in 1970, and then the FBI people became my sources. And I've never seen the FBI scared before. They're scared now, particularly in Washington.
Yeah.
And there's real deep concern when the intelligence community isn't listened to. There's really just confusion.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right, but I think we're also at a point of chaos, that especially sort of emotional and intellectual chaos, that something has to give sooner or later.
Yeah, I could respond to that and go somewhere else, but I don't want to. I want to, Neil, do you have a comment on public funding?
Yeah, to Lowell's point, the government has always been involved with journalism from day one, and he listed many of the ways, right? Even now, the California census advertising, $40 million in census advertising from the state of California is what kept a lot of the smaller publishers in the state alive for the last 6 months during the virus. We've been working with a lot of the smaller ethnic and community publishers, trying to help them stay afloat when the virus took away a lot of their advertising, a lot of their distribution, and that government money is essential. We've talked to some members of Congress about what's going on now with these various bills, everything from a tax credit for donating to a nonprofit or buying a subscription to your local newspaper, to what Mayor de Blasio did in New York, ordering that city agencies there take half of their marketing dollars and put those into community media organizations, not just the big publishers. A lot of different things going on to try to keep government support. I was talking to the publisher of a paper up in Humboldt County on an Indian reservation, where their circulation is like 1,600 copies. They have to drive 120 miles to do the delivery route to get the 30 drop points for 1,600 copies of the paper. And as much as people keep telling her, you should really go digital, she says, that's great, but half the reservation's not even covered by cell towers, right? A little hard to go digital when there's no service. So in that economy, there's not a lot of money floating around there and the businesses and the people who live there. Government funds are what keep a publisher like that alive. It's advertising, it's better than just getting grants, but we have to get over this crazy idea that somehow if we let the government help journalism, we're going to be polluted by them. It's in the First Amendment, to Lowell's point. They've been helping us since day one, and we need it.
Right, and we created the Center for Investigative Reporting in 1977.
Yeah.
Right, as a nonprofit, the first nonprofit to do investigative reporting and approved by the IRS. And there's now over 200 of them in the United States, not to mention everybody around the world, all nonprofit, whether it's ProPublica with lots of money, right,
Yep.
to all kinds of organizations. Even ProPublica with their banks of money are now helping local and regional reporting. So that part of it is recognized by the government and by legislation in terms of nonprofit status. We can talk some other time about what the downsides of nonprofit are, but the fact is that it's pretty vibrant in the United States. I argue again that electronic media is different than print media. And by that, I mean, it's creating the real problems that we're dealing with, both the volume in terms of how much disinformation is produced. There's always been disinformation. Remember the conspiracy theories about the Warren Commission. I mean, there's always been conspiracy theories. It's the question of about everything, about anything, and the networks. I blame the current broadcasting networks for keeping Donald Trump on the air, because the denigration of the conversation was then, if you will, approved by the establishment. And once you have that kind of behavior as something that people can watch easily, which they'll watch tomorrow on a net, in a so-called debate, then things aren't going to get better. It's poison.
Is there any reason or advantage to support the Google breakup or the antitrust actions of regulating the social media giants?
Regulating, yes. I don't know. I'm not sure the antitrust, breaking them up idea is the same as the regulation, right? But there are people in Congress talking about Section 230 and whether you could take it away, rewrite it, eliminate it, give them some liability. There's been
Neil, could you explain Section 230 to the audience a little bit?
Yeah, it's the idea that a carrier of information, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world, need to be open platforms, right? They should be able to let people say whatever they want to, and they shouldn't be regulating what's said on there. And so they are given immunity from responsibility for the content, I think is probably the best way to explain it.
They're called common carriers.
They're common carrier. They're just I didn't write that horrible Facebook post. I'm just Facebook. I just showed it to you.
Just a pipe.
Yeah. And at some point, in our history, right, there have been situations where industry responded to pressure and decided to regulate itself before the government regulated it. There have been some little moves like that from Facebook and Google, but I don't think there's been enough of a threat of real regulation that they see a need to do it, right? And their businesses are working just fine.
Antitrust is attractive, but the history of it is, did you know that NBC was once two networks? Had two radio networks. They dominated radio in America. So they broke them up in like 1950 or 51. The second network is ABC. ABC had less news on it than NBC. So, and didn't really have a half an hour of news until 1973. So it doesn't mean that it's going to get better if you break it up. It means the marketplace is different. But again, there has to be a conversation about regulating content, in my view. I keep repeating myself, but that's because people are afraid, well, who is going to decide who should be able to say what, when? And that's a whole nother conversation.
Well, you,
about the regulation, the amount of enforcement that happens in this country around banking and financial transactions, right? Sure, a lot of people get away with a lot of things, but a lot of stuff is heavily regulated, and the Treasury Department and the Secret Service are watching financial transactions back and forth. You know, you mentioned the fairness doctrine and the regulation. I mean, Raleigh, I grew up near you. I grew up in Washington, D.C. And my dad was a lawyer. He represented radio and TV stations before the Federal Communications Commission. And he wrote a book called The Candidates Checklist. It was for small town candidates running in local elections to understand their equal time rights and all the rights they had and how they could do, just what Lowell was talking about, how you claim the equal time you're due when somebody says something negative about you on the local TV station. That was a level of regulation that is not unusual for us. We have heavy regulation in a lot of industries. And the reason for the regulation in things like the banking industry is so people can't either steal money or hide it from the tax authorities, right? If you decide that disinformation is bad, you could regulate it. But I don't know as a country that we're ready to have that conversation, or that anything, to Lowell's point, anything short of a civil war is going to force that conversation.
yeah.
Scary.
Well, Lowell referenced the conversation he and I have been having, and maybe we could bring this forward. I mean, Lowell, you're an advocate of it's not proper or it's illegal to call out fire in a crowded theater, which is a limit to free speech, which is a stark thing for journalists to support. That goes to a limit. Is that limit changed now in the environment and world we live in?
I'm going to say that I wouldn't want the job, or no one would give me the job, I think, of deciding what should be on or shouldn't be on. But, or I think it's more of a question in the modern world of the opportunity of technology. What we've done is not only allowed people to say whatever they want to say on the internet, but it has infinite distribution. And I think that the instantaneous distribution issue is what was confronted by Herbert Hoover with radio. It's different than reading things, and it has to reach a certain standard. That standard can be set by a public-private commission. It could be set in a lot of different ways through a national dialogue, but there have to be standards. There are standards in any newspaper. Everything is filtered in a newspaper to a great extent, especially, let's say, responsible newspapers. And that filtering is part of the reason people trusted them. But when you have a situation where nobody can tell what's true and not true, doesn't have the equipment and ability or time to figure it out, it would be like sitting at an editorial desk at your paper, and it all lands on your desk, and they say, "Well, you figure it out."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't tell what it is, if it's true or not. And in fact, so I'm not. There's always been limits on free speech of all kinds, that not just the fire in a theater limit either, right? And can you actually, during a pandemic, should you be allowed to say that what the scientists say will help the nation to survive and people to stay alive? Are you allowed to say that that's bullshit?
Yeah.
To an audience of the whole country? Should you be allowed to do that? There's a reason why public health people have titles like Surgeon General. A public health emergency means you shut your mouth and listen to what's going on.
Yep. Is it?
And I just think that's why I said the First Amendment's become a suicide pact.
Can you text the word fire to everybody sitting in a movie house? I mean,
You have to, the decision actually went both ways and is interpreted different ways. It's either there wasn't a fire, but you can't yell fire if there wasn't a fire in a movie house. Yes, you can if there is a fire. Either way, you can debate it either way.
Yeah.
Especially if you're the one starting the fire. I mean,
You're the one who's got to get out of the theater.
Yeah, to your point, like the kinds of disinformation, right? It's one thing to spread, political opinions. It's another thing to spread to specifically do something that is designed. Yelling fire in a crowded movie house causes a stampede and somebody gets hurt, right? There's a negative effect to that, and that's where that concept comes from, right? If you look at the damage done by some of this disinformation, people getting attacked, Dr. Fauci having security details
on his children and his family.
And his children and his family, right? And probably anybody in the country with a name that sounds like Fauci is in trouble. And the guy going into the pizza restaurant with a gun, right?
Right.
Those are acts of disinformation that cause a negative effect on society that if that person had yelled fire in a crowded movie house, they might have been, somebody might have decided what they did was illegal. It's almost like we have the underlying premises here, but we don't have the way to regulate it. We don't have the cooperation of the tech platforms. And how would you even get your arms around that?
Well, Zuckerberg has, in all of his, mealy mouth running around, he has said now 2 or 3 times, at least twice, tell me what the regulations are, and we'll accept them. And there are ways in which traditionally the broadcasters and other industries have accepted regulation as long as everybody had the same rules.
Right.
And then they knew they could lobby Congress to work around the edges and play their game. But in this atmosphere, what they're worried about is they're going to get axed in some fashion and their fabulous profits will disappear.
Yeah.
And so they're worried to a certain extent as well. But I'd leave you with one of my little reporting things that I couldn't report in the film. I have run into senior officials of law enforcement agencies, of the federal government and intelligence agencies who are scared about what's happening.
Yeah.
The FBI leadership is holding on by their fingernails. They're waiting for the election to be over. They're hoping it goes that way because the head of the FBI, the current guy, Ray, was like every other day he was being attacked by Trump.
Yeah.
They were worried.
That's great. That's great because we're right in the flow here because we're ready to do some final comments and wrap up a little bit. So for fun, Lowell and Neil, and thank you guys both again for this great conversation.
Fun conversation. Yeah,
I don't know if you're looking at the chat room, but people are really, really enjoying this.
Send money to
Yes.
Sonoma West.
Yeah, say
Absolutely.
a little louder, Lowell. Can I hear that?
Send money to Sonoma West so they can hire me in my retirement.
Yeah, he's made the offer. We're negotiating. Absolutely.
You can auction me off.
I want to hear some predictions. The election, post-election. What we've been talking about, trying to have a fair and free election in this age of disinformation. You level-headed, sensible guys. What would you warn us about? What do you really think might be happening? It certainly looks historic. We don't know in what exact fashion, but it certainly looks historic.
You think about the elections that were held in this country, recently, but especially 50 plus years ago, right? With all sorts of ways to suppress voters that in many cases were government run. You could argue that free and fair elections have always been kind of a fleeting concept, right? There's always been little stories here and there. There's been, there's always some misbehavior in the administration of an election. That's why we put 30 more reporters on the street to try to cover it this year. But you look at the numbers, and those incidences have always been relatively small. If you take out state governments stopping people from voting, which is still happening today, I would argue that what some states are doing to suppress their residents from voting is having far more effect than somebody vandalizing a ballot box, somebody fomenting fear about the postal service, those sorts of things. I'm not as worried about whether this election is going to be, free and fair. If the results are convincing, it might help with the aftermath. But to Lowell's point, the fear about what's going to happen afterward and how people are going to react to what happens. I'm much more worried about the day after the election than the election itself.
What do you see any visuals, Neil?
Boy, I think it's entirely possible, and maybe I'm just being, too rosy here. I think it's entirely possible that we get through the election. If the Democrats end up winning in a convincing way, that people kind of move on, right? That you've always had a number of people who had conspiracy theories and talked about them, but they were never elevated to the level they've been at in the past 4 years. I think things could quiet down a little bit, and to an extent, some of the heat goes away. But the ability for people who want to cause something to happen in this country to run, scientifically planned, very efficient disinformation campaigns, and not yelling the wrong thing at somebody, but doing all the mechanical things you do to make disinformation seem real and to convince people who are willing to be convinced. That's a long-term problem. That's not going away. It's not. I think the heat might go down if the election results are convincing, but long-term, absent some regulation or some real stepping up by some of these tech platforms that hasn't happened yet, that's going to be with us for a long time.
Lowell?
Well, I think I just quickly, I'm hoping we get through it, and that we get through it, maybe even just stumble through it. But we have to keep in mind that Joe Biden is at the end of his career. This is his last, if he wins. Kamala Harris wasn't a great attorney general or in California, known for doing police reform or much of anything for that matter, except the status quo. So we still need another generation of leadership, it seems to me, beyond this. And we may, as I've said, need a much bigger crisis, because Donald Trump has exposed the fact that there is this id, if you will, this hidden, semi-hidden, segregationist, if you will, racist, authoritarian impulse in the American people, in a large portion of the population. We can't deny that. The tens of millions of people who believe things that are demonstrably false. And you don't undo that in an election. There has to be something that triggers a greater effort to bring us back to the kind of vision that caused, for example, I'm always amazed by Watergate, that Watergate even happened at the time. Nobody's really explained why it happened. Nixon won by a landslide, and he had a program, it was revealed, to institute an authoritarian state in the United States. It went down to the local level. We've forgotten all that, the church committee hearings and so on. So we went through a crisis that was probably much more violent in terms of what was going on the street then than today, and in many ways very threatening, but it all turned around. And this time around, I think it's going to be equally surprising how it may turn around. I don't have any idea what exactly it's going to be, but it's going to be pretty intense.
You guys are surprising me a little bit. You're more positive and hopeful than I expected your response.
What's the point? What's the point of saying it's all going to go to shit? Can't sell any newspapers about that.
What do you, when Trump loses in November, we go through December and a little part of January. I mean, what do you think he might do?
It's a fascinating thing to try to game, and there are people wargaming out what could happen. And you think of everything from he just gives up and walks away because he has a short attention span, to he spends the next two months or so trying to get everything done he would have done over the next 4 years. And there's no, this isn't about him, right? This is the people who are behind him and around him with real specific agendas that are far more detailed than he ever had. He's got a lot done, and he's got a lot of damage you can still do in a couple months as president if he wants to, right? If he still has interest.
Yeah.
The question is going to be, if the last time, again, is Richard Nixon, he was able to negotiate a pardon of anything he did while he was president, right? And that was a federal pardon. Trump's got a problem. He's got state laws that he's violated and attorneys general who are pissed off.
Yeah.
So what's he going to do? And that's why I said the coming civil war. He can't afford, how much money he's got and doesn't have what his real assets are, we really don't know, because your income tax return doesn't tell you what his assets are. So he may be able to pay his debt off. We haven't seen, by the way, the debt that Deutsche Bank is holding on him and where that came from initially. So there's certain unanswered questions still around him. But I just leave you with that thought. If you're Donald Trump, what's your next act? The only act he ever has been successful at, truly successful, was as a reality TV star, making believe he was a billionaire. It was such a good act that it made tons of money, and it made him president of the United States.
Yeah, crazy. So I want to thank you guys again immensely for your time and
Yeah,
focus.
I got to run. Sorry, I'm a little late myself.
Yeah, well, I'm wrapping up. I got one more minute. I want to bring this back home, because before, underneath the age of disinformation, that's creating a national discussion around a historic election and around trying to live through pandemic and COVID. We already had a news industry that was going through disarray, and we're back at that in middle America, where small communities have lost their newspapers, and they've lost their outlet of honest and reputable, credible news, and we're going to be left with that underneath of all of this. So I hope somewhere out of this we can gain a focus to get back to some truth seeking and finding fair and credible ways to bring that conversation back at city council elections and school board meetings, and how we vote on local taxes. I mean, that's 80% or more of our daily lives. And I just treasure CalMatters, Neil, for we've been a very active partner for the last few months, and just today, that analysis of Prop 13 that you put up, that's required reading for every taxpayer in California.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
To your point, Raleigh, I'm not worried about local journalism as much. Yes, it's gone away. Yes, it's gotten worse. Yes, there are a lot of holes now in the local journalism network around the country. There are so many efforts going on now to raise private money, to enable ways for that one person in a community who wants to start a local news organization to start that organization. A lot of workshops and things, a lot of private funding. We've raised a bunch of money separate from CalMatters, or within CalMatters, but for separate purposes, to help smaller community publishers up and down California, ethnic media publishers. The part about covering the city council, what goes on in your town, I think we can fix that. We can come to a new business model that makes that work with government support, with public funding and things like that. That part I feel confident about addressing, and that's what I'm sort of spending this part of my career on. The bigger picture, the national issues, the disinformation, stuff like that, that's the intimidating stuff that is harder for me to get my hands around what we can do about it. Obviously, tremendously important and a little less in our control, but I think we can handle the local part.
Yeah. So I know Lowell has grandkids.
Yeah.
He's got to go check on.
Okay.
I'll let you guys know, and thank you once again, and everyone else will be viewing this now and recording, that this conversation and conversations related to local journalism and the broader focus of journalism will continue at Sonoma West Publishers and the Sonoma County Local News Initiative. It's a big part of our mission, and you know, we're going to take advantage of Zoom and sheltering and working in place, because I mean, if the three of us that I'm looking at on my computer screen right now had to figure out how to get from Berkeley to Sacramento to San Jose to here, we just wouldn't have happened. So that's a huge advantage that we're able to carry on these conversations.
Yep.
So,
Okay, thank you.
so thank you all once again.
Nice to see you, Neil.
Good to see you, Lowell.
Take care.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.